Okay, on our next part of the video, I'm going to discuss the processor, also known as CPU, which is Central Processing Unit, and the heatsink / cooling fan. The processor or CPU, I'm sure you've heard of processors in a computer before. Two brands that come to mind normally are AMD and Intel. There are other little ones out there for mobile devices and some other portable devices and such. But Intel and AMD are probably the two big ones when we're talking actual physical computers. Basically, what a processor does is just think of it as a calculator. I mean, that's kind of what it does. It receives the instructions, then it tries to analyze the instructions or decodes it or translates it, whatever you want to go, so it understands what it's supposed to do. Okay. Then it actually will perform the instructions, and then finally it will give you the results, much like a calculator. You know how that works. It's the same kind of concept. That's basically what the processor does. So that's where a fast processor means it can get the instructions and all that, the process done a lot quicker. Got exactly what processor implies. It processes the data and instructions. So anyway, I'm going to show you how that works coming up. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the processor, the CPU. That's the front side of it, and that's the bottom side of it. The bottom side, you'll see, has a lot of pins. Make sure not to bend those pins. And now what I'm going to show you is where it goes on the motherboard, which is that big white spot where you'll see a bunch of holes for the pins. You want to make sure that you line that processor up with the socket accordingly. It'll generally only go in one way. You'll notice a little gold notch on the processor, maybe even a cutout notch on the processor, and that indicates the notched point, which you'll see also on the socket of the motherboard itself, which tells you where to place it. And you'll see I just lifted a lever on the motherboard. That lever you must have opened before you can place the processor in. It opens the socket up so something can be placed in it. You should simply just drop it in place. It should not require any force whatsoever to get it in there. And then you just close the socket and snap it in place. Now the processor's in. But we're not done. The processor needs to be cooled. If the processor's not cooled, it'll overheat or melt down, whatever. Nowadays, it probably would just shut your computer off before it get damaged. However, regardless, it needs to be cooled. First thing you do is you will make sure the surface is clean. You don't want any dust on it. You don't want any finger smudges or prints on it. Now I'm showing you the thermal paste, which is what we apply to the processor. It's basically the interface that goes in between the processor and the heatsink, which allows the heat to be transferred off the processor and through the heatsink and away. So what you do is what I just showed you there is I just put a little bit of dab on the processor. Now we're going to use a little trusty spreading device to spread this paste. I used old credit cards, things like that work perfect for something like this. The goal here when you're spreading this is to make it as smooth as possible and as thin as possible without, of course, making it so thin that it's not there. And just take your time on it. I am very meticulous about this. Others may not be so much, but you just gotta make it nice and smooth and thin, because the thinner you make it but the smoother you make it without any air bubbles, etc., the better your heat transfer will be. And of course that means better the cooling of your processor will have and the longer the life of it. Occasionally I clean off the cards so that I don't get thermal paste all over the place. So you will probably get some on your fingers. Now, I actually take that paste and cover the entire heat spreader of that processor. Now, there's actually some cores or die underneath it. And what really is important is just to make sure you have thermal paste between the die or the cores and that. But what I do is I cover the entire heat spreader, because that way I ensure that the die will have thermal paste over it. So that way I'm not left guessing where the cores are at on the processor itself. So I just cover the whole thing. And there's no risk, there's no worrying about it, you just know it should be protected. Now, a thing that I haven't mentioned yet is if you are getting a brand new processor in retail box with a heatsink assembly already, you shouldn't need to probably do this. There will actually be a pad, a thermal pad on the bottom of the heatsink, which is what the thermal interface is in that case, and you wouldn't have to put all this paste on. However, sometimes it actually is better, depending on the thermal paste that's on the heatsink built in, sometimes it's better to just put your own thermal paste on anyway and clean away the old. So you can tell I'm still being meticulous about this, making sure the entire heat spreader is covered. I spend some time on this. It's not probably necessary to spend as much time as I do on it. However, I want to make sure I don't have to undo this and do it again. Remember to keep yourself grounded to your computer case the entire time you're working on this. Anytime you're touching any of the circuit boards and such, you definitely should have it on. It shouldn't require a ton of thermal paste, just a little bit, just enough where you can get the whole surface covered with a thin layer, thin smooth layer. Just be patient with it. Again, I'm probably more particular about it than I need to be. Okay, now we're going to put the heatsink on. I showed you a sandwich bag, which you think's weird, but you'll understand here in a minute what I'm up to. Here's our heatsink with fan assembly. You'll hear the cat, he's really trying to annoy me right now. Notice the pretty clean surface at the bottom of that heatsink. That's again important that that's also clean, since that's another interface contact point. I'm not actually touching that, I'm just pointing at that. What you do is put your hand in the sandwich bag. I know it will make no sense. And we're going to put just a teeny tiny dab of thermal paste on the heatsink. Not very much at all, just a teeny tiny bit. Just enough to have some on the heatsink base. I'm going to put my hand in the bag. And now what I'm going to do is take my finger and hand. Yes, I'm talking like a penguin with my hand. And I'm going to just start doing a swirling motion with my hand on the thermal paste. We're going to spread the thermal paste around with my hand in the bag. What we're basically trying to accomplish here is just to get the thermal paste in any pits and valleys that might be in that heat sink, because you want it to fill any cracks, crevices, etc. in the heat sink. If you don't, you might have a gap where there's not going to be any heat escaping, or etc. When you get done, what you should end up with on the base of the heatsink is just basically a haze of gray or whatever the color happens to be from the thermal paste. It should just be a haze. It shouldn't be any thickness at all. It should just look like it's kind of dirty looking. So you can tell you can still even see it's kind of reflective, even though it's got that on the base. Again, when you have another heatsink, a new heatsink, it has a thermal paste on it already. Okay, now we're going to put the heatsink on the motherboard, which is going on top of the processor. You'll notice some clips where it will latch onto. Line that up correctly. I don't think it matters on these which direction you have the heatsink, but just make sure that you line it up obviously with the clips. I like to do the clip without the screwdriver end first, so it's in place. Then the other end will have a lock on it, and it will normally have a slot where you can put like a screwdriver in it to help you push it down. This one's pretty easy to do by hand now, so we're going to just use my hand. Again, make sure you're grounded, which I don't know if I was previously, which is bad. Anyway, so we're going to push down on that second clip. We're going to get it in there. The second clip will always be much harder than the first. It might require some force. Just do not put force directly on the heatsink itself. Put it on the clip. Otherwise you can damage your processor. Then all I have to do is that black lever, you take it, you turn it, which I just did already, and it locks in place. It requires, again, a little bit of force to make that lever turn. Our heatsink's in place. Don't forget the wire going from the fan. You need to plug that into the motherboard, otherwise you'll have no fan, which is bad, of course. So I'm going to take that. It'll probably only go in one way. They normally put a notch in the connector, so you can only put it in one way, and it'll be on the header of the motherboard that says CPU fan or something to that effect. And you just plug her in, and now you got it. Now you got a processor and a fan.